I was 15 years old when I birthed the baby boy, in secret, fathered by the man who'd been raping me since I was 13, our colored servant Ezekiel, and my daddy killed him for it. Buried his body in that old dry well behind our barn, and we never spoke of it again, not once in 65 years. My name's Mildred Carter, though folks round here just call me Miss Millie. I'm 80 years old now, been living in this same small Alabama town my whole life, and to most folks, I'm just that sweet old lady who brings pound cake to church socials and grows the prettiest roses in the county. They see me at the Piggly Wiggly every Tuesday, shuffling down them aisles with my little cart, stopping to chat about the weather or ask after somebody's grandbabies. At the beauty parlor, where I still get my hair set every Friday like clockwork, the younger ladies always say, "Miss Millie, you're just precious as pie." And I smile and nod like I ain't got a care in the world cept whether my tomatoes gonna come in good this year. But Lord knows, I've been carrying this weight so long it's done worn grooves in my soul deeper than wagon ruts and old clay roads. And now, with my time getting short and the truth scratching at my throat like a caged animal, I reckon it's time somebody knew what really happened back in 1959 on that isolated farm where innocents went to die. So if you got the stomach for it, sit a spell and let me tell you the whole truth about how a young girl's life got stolen. A man got murdered, and a baby got given away like he was nothing more than an unwanted kitten. This here's my confession, and Lord help me, every word of it's true. I still remember the smell of bacon grease and cornbread that last peaceful morning, back in the spring of '57 when I was just 13 and the world still made sense. Mama was humming in the suite by and by while she worked the stove, and Daddy was out on the porch already, sipping his coffee black as midnight and watching the sun creep up over our cotton fields. Everything was golden then, washed in that early morning light that made even our weathered old farmhouse look like something out of a picture book. We wasn't rich folks, not by a long shot, but we had enough. Daddy owned 200 acres of good Alabama soil, and he worked it honest with his own two hands. Mama kept house and tended her vegetable garden. And us three kids, me, my brother Samuel, and little sister Ruth, we all had our chores but plenty of time for playing too. I loved climbing the big oak tree out back, reading up there in the branches while the mockingbirds sang their borrowed songs all around me. That's when Ezekiel first come to us, that spring of '57. He showed up at our door one April morning, hat in hand, asking Daddy if he needed help with the planting. I remember peeking out from behind Mama's skirts, watching this tall, lean-colored man with the gentlest eyes I ever did see. He spoke soft and respectful, called Daddy sir and Mama ma'am, and when he smiled at us kids, it was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "I'm a hard worker, Mr. Carter," he said. "I don't need much, just a fair wage and maybe a place to lay my head. I can sleep in the barn, if that suits you." Daddy looked him up and down, real careful like. In them days, it wasn't common for a white family to have a colored man living on the property, not in our parts anyway. But something about Ezekiel must have struck Daddy right, 'cause after a long minute, he nodded. "Reckon I could use an extra pair of hands come harvest time," Daddy said. "There's an old cabin out past the cornfield. Ain't much, but it's got 4 walls and a roof that mostly don't leak. You can fix it up if you've a mind to." And just like that, Ezekiel became part of our world. He moved into that little cabin with nothing but a canvas bag and his Bible. And Lord, how that man could work. From sunup to sundown, he was out in them fields with Daddy, never complaining, always ready with a helping hand or a cheerful word. Mama took to sending us kids out with his lunch, cornbread and buttermilk, maybe some leftover ham, and he'd always thank us like we'd brought him a feast fit for a king. "Miss Mildred," he'd say to me, 'cause I was the oldest and usually the one carrying the basket, "you tell your mama this, here's the best cornbread in all of Alabama. Y'all are mighty kind to an old servant like me." He wasn't old, not really, maybe 35 or 40, though it was hard to tell. But he called himself old, and he called himself our servant, and we never thought nothing of it. That's just how things was. Looking back now, I can see the signs clear as day. The way he'd watch me when he thought nobody was looking. How his hand would linger just a heartbeat too long when I'd pass him the water bucket. The little gifts he'd leave on our porch, wildflowers for Mama. He'd say, but they'd always be the purple ones I'd mentioned liking. Once he carved a little wooden bird and gave it to me, said it was for all us kids, but he pressed it into my hand, special like. held my fingers closed around it. "You keep this safe now, Miss Mildred," he whispered. "Some things is just between friends." I treasured that little bird, kept it in my dresser drawer wrapped in a handkerchief, thought it was the sweetest thing, a grown man taking time to make something pretty for a young girl. Mama smiled when I showed her, said Ezekiel was a blessing, how he was so good with us children. If I'd known then what I know now, I'd have thrown that carved bird in the fire and begged Daddy to send him away. But I was 13, and innocent as morning dew, and when the devil comes, he don't come with horns and a pitchfork. He comes with kind eyes and gentle words, calling himself a servant while he plans to make you his slave. The first crack in our perfect world came that summer, the day Ezekiel asked if I'd like to learn to read better. See, I loved books but struggled with the big words, and somehow he knew that. Said he'd had some schooling, could help me if my folks didn't mind. Mama and Daddy, they thought it was right Christian of him, offering to help like that. "Just make sure y'all stay on the porch where we can see you," Mama said. And that should have been that, but it wasn't. Oh Lord, it wasn't. Chapter 3, The Seeds of Ambition. The reading lessons started innocent enough. Right there on our front porch with the door wide open and Mama's hymn singing drifting out from the kitchen. Ezekiel would sit in Daddy's rocking chair, and I'd pull up the little stool beside him, my McGuffey reader spread across my lap. He smelled like earth and sweat, and something else I couldn't name then, something that made my stomach feel funny, though I told myself it was just 'cause I was nervous about reading aloud. "You got a real smart mind, Miss Mildred," he'd say when I stumbled over a word. "Smarter than most folks give you credit for, I reckon. You just need someone who understands you." That's how it started. See, with understanding. He'd nod when I talked about feeling trapped in our small town, how I dreamed of seeing the world beyond Alabama. He'd listen when I complained about Mama always favoring Ruth 'cause she was the baby, or how Samuel got to do all the interesting chores just 'cause he was a boy. "World ain't fair to special girls like you," he'd murmur, his voice low and sympathetic. "But I see you, Miss Mildred. I see who you really are." By the time the cotton was high as my waist, our lessons had moved to his cabin. "Just for a few minutes," he said, "just to get this one book he had that would help me." Mama was busy with the canning, and Daddy was working the far field. Nobody noticed when I slipped away. His cabin was neater than I expected. Everything in its place. He had books, real books, lined up on a shelf he'd made from old planks. I'd never seen a colored man with so many books before. "Where'd you get all these?" I asked, running my finger along the spines. "Oh, here and there," he said, closing the door against the afternoon heat. "Some folks don't think a man like me should have books, but I always believed in bettering myself. Same as you, Miss Mildred. We're alike that way." I should have felt it then, the wrongness of it. A grown man closing the door with a 13-year-old girl inside. But he'd spent months making me feel special, understood, mature beyond my years. When he put his hand on my shoulder, I thought it was fatherly. When he tucked that strand of hair behind my ear, I thought it was kind. "You're growing up so fast," he said, and his voice was different now, thicker somehow, becoming a real woman. "Your mama probably don't see it, but I do." That's when he showed me the photograph. It was tucked inside one of his books, a picture of a white woman in a fancy dress, standing in front of a big house with columns. "That there's Mrs. Adelaide Thornton," he said, watching my face. "I worked for her family up in Montgomery, before I came here. She's beautiful," I said, "because she was all golden hair and pearl necklaces. She was kind to me," he said, taking the photograph back, his fingers brushing mine. "Real kind. Used to say I was more gentleman than servant. Course, her husband didn't appreciate that. That's why I had to leave." I understood what he was implying. Even young as I was, a colored man and a white woman being too friendly, that was dangerous talk, the kind that got people killed. But the way he told it, it sounded almost romantic, like something out of those novels Mama didn't know I read. "Did you love her?" I whispered. He smiled then, but it wasn't the warm smile I was used to. This one had shadows in it. "Love's a funny thing, Miss Mildred. Sometimes it grows in places it shouldn't. Sometimes it takes forms folks don't understand. But it's still love, just the same." He put his hand over mine then, and I felt the weight of it, heavy and warm. "You won't tell nobody about Mrs. Adelaide, will you? That's our secret, yours and mine. Just like these special lessons." I shook my head, feeling grown up and important. Ezekiel trusted me with his secrets. Nobody had ever done that before. But here's what I learned later. What made my blood run cold when I finally understood. There was no Mrs. Adelaide Thornton. I know, 'cause years after everything happened, I looked, searched through old Montgomery Society pages at the library, asked around, discreet, like no Thornton family ever had an estate like the one in that picture. That photograph was probably just something he found or stole, a prop in his careful play. He'd made up that whole story about a forbidden romance, painted himself as a tragic figure, a gentleman trapped in a servant's life, and I'd swallowed it whole, started seeing him not as Daddy's hired hand, but as some kind of misunderstood hero. The touching started gradual after that, a hand on my knee while we read, an arm around my shoulders that pulled me just a little too close. His breath on my neck as he leaned over to point at a word. "You're trembling," he'd say. "You cold, Miss Mildred." I wasn't cold. I was scared, but I didn't have words for it then. And when I'd tried to pull away, he'd look hurt, wounded even. "I thought we was friends," he'd say. "I thought you was different from the others, that you understood. Guess I was wrong. And Lord help me, I'd feel guilty." This man who'd been nothing but kind, who'd taught me to read better, who'd trusted me with his secrets, I didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I'd stay still, let his hand rest where it shouldn't, tell myself it didn't mean nothing. By the time the leaves started turning, I was spending near every afternoon in that cabin, and the reading lessons had become something else entirely, something that made me feel sick and special all at once, something I knew was wrong but couldn't figure out how to stop. "You can't tell nobody about our time together," he'd remind me each day before I left. "They wouldn't understand. They'd think bad of you, call you names. You know how folks are." I did know. I'd heard the words they used for girls who were too friendly with men, especially colored men, so I kept quiet, locked it all inside, even as the weight of it started crushing me from the inside out. But the worst part, the part that haunts me still, is that I thought I was choosing it. He'd made me believe I was mature, special, different. He'd made me believe this was something I wanted, even as my body told me otherwise. Even as I started finding excuses not to eat so I wouldn't have to walk past his cabin on the way to bring him lunch. The devil had done his work well. He'd built a prison around me bar by bar, and I'd helped him do it, thinking I was building something else entirely. By the time I realized I was trapped, it was too late. The door was locked, and he had the only key. By winter, my world had shrunk down to the size of Ezekiel's cabin. Oh, I still went through the motions, helped Mama with the washing, did my schoolwork, played with Ruth when she pestered me enough. But it was like I was watching myself from far away, like the real me was trapped somewhere else, and this girl walking around in my skin was just pretending. Ezekiel had gotten smarter about it by then. No more afternoon visits that might raise eyebrows. Instead, he'd find reasons to be wherever I was. If I was gathering eggs, he'd need something from the barn. If I was hanging laundry, he'd be fixing the fence right nearby. Always watching, always waiting for them little moments when nobody else was looking. "Saw you talking to that Williams boy after church," he'd say, his voice casual but his eyes hard. "He's sweet on you, ain't he?" "Just being polite," I'd mumble, but my hands would shake. Tommy Williams had walked me to Daddy's truck, carried my hymnal for me. It wasn't nothing, but Ezekiel made it sound like I'd done something shameful. "Polite," he'd repeat, shaking his head. "That's how it starts, Miss Mildred. Next thing you know, folks'll be saying you're fast. And what would your daddy think then?" The isolation happened so gradual, I didn't notice at first. My friend Sarah stopped coming around after Ezekiel told her mama he'd seen us sneaking cigarettes behind the schoolhouse. We hadn't been. Sarah wouldn't touch tobacco if her life depended on it, but her mama believed him over us. Why would that nice colored man lie? Then Mary Beth's mama heard from somebody who heard from somebody else that I'd been saying ugly things about Mary Beth's daddy's drinking. I hadn't, but Ezekiel had been in town that day, helping load feed at the store. And folks remembered seeing him there, remembered him shaking his head sad-like when my name came up. One by one, my friends fell away. The invitations to birthday parties stopped coming. The girls at school whispered when I walked by, then got quiet when I got close. Even at church, folks started looking at me different, like I was a problem that needed solving. Mama noticed, of course. "Mildred, honey, what's going on with you and the other girls?" I wanted to tell her. Lord, how I wanted to fall into her arms and sob out the whole truth. But Ezekiel's words were always there. "They'll blame you. Say, you led me on." A young white girl and a colored man. You know how that story ends. So I'd shrug and say, just growing apart, I guess. The worst part was how he played the perfect servant in front of everybody else. When Daddy praised his work, Ezekiel would duck his head humble-like. When Mama sent him extra food at Christmas, he'd near about cry with gratitude. At church, 'cause yes, he'd started coming to our church, sitting in the back section, where the colored folks were allowed. He'd sing them hymns like his soul depended on it. That Ezekiel's a good Christian man, folks would say. The Carters are lucky to have him. I tried writing a letter once, to my cousin Lucille up in Birmingham. Spent hours on it, pouring out everything. The letter never made it. Ezekiel was the one who went to town for the mail run. When he came back, he found me alone in the kitchen and set that letter down in front of me, still sealed. Postmaster asked me to give this back to you. He said quiet-like. Said there wasn't enough postage. There was enough postage. I'd checked 3 times. Funny thing, he continued, pulling out his knife to clean his fingernails, how a letter like this could cause so much trouble. Get a lot of folks hurt. Your daddy, for instance. Man's got a reputation to protect. He folded his knife, slipped it back in his pocket, and smiled at me, gentle as you please. After that, I stopped trying. He'd cut me off from everybody who might help, painted me as a troubled girl who couldn't be trusted. I started spending more time alone, up in my room or out in the fields where nobody went. My world had gotten so small it was just me and my shame and Ezekiel's eyes following me everywhere. The trap was perfect, and I was caught in it. Good the spring I turned 14. The bad days had a rhythm to them like a terrible song you can't get out of your head. Monday through Friday, Ezekiel would find me somewhere behind the chicken coop, in the root cellar, out by the well, and it would happen again, quick and awful, and leaving me feeling like I'd been turned inside out. Saturdays he went to town. Sundays we all went to church, where I'd sit between Mama and Ruth, trying not to throw up while Ezekiel sang Amazing Grace from the colored section. You're getting too thin, Mama fretted, watching me push food around my plate, and them dark circles under your eyes. You sleeping all right, honey? I'd nod and make myself swallow a bite of cornbread that tasted like sawdust. Everything tasted like sawdust then. Colors had gone gray too, like the whole world was covered in ash. Even my favorite dress, the yellow one with tiny flowers, looked dingy to me now. I stopped looking in mirrors, couldn't stand to see the girl looking back, the one who let this happen, who didn't fight hard enough, who must have done something to deserve it. Started wearing Daddy's old work shirts over my dresses, trying to hide the body that had betrayed me by growing curves that caught a grown man's attention. The me I used to be, the girl who climbed trees and read books and dreamed of traveling the world, she was disappearing like morning mist. In her place was this other thing, this creature that knew how to go slack, how to float up to the ceiling and watch from above while bad things happened to the body below. I got so good at leaving myself, sometimes I'd forget to come back. You ain't right, Ruth said, one evening, finding me sitting on my bed, staring at nothing. You ain't been right for months. What's wrong with you? Nothing's wrong, I said, but my voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. The saddest part was how normal it all looked from the outside. Ezekiel had worked it so careful, so smart. He never left marks where they'd show, never took too long, so nobody wondered where I was. And he always had a reason for being wherever he found me. Fixing this, fetching that, helping with something Daddy had asked him to do. To everybody else, he was still wonderful. Ezekiel, he'd started teaching Samuel how to whittle. He'd fixed Mama's good rocking chair when the arm broke. He'd even helped organize the colored folks to raise money for new hymnals at church. Reverend Patterson had thanked him from the pulpit, called him a pillar of the community. Meanwhile, I was becoming a ghost in my own life. Stopped raising my hand in school, even when I knew the answers. Stopped singing in the youth choir. Stopped doing anything that might make people notice me, 'cause being noticed felt dangerous now. I ever tell you about my mama? Ezekiel asked one day, after we were in the barn, and I was trying to fix my hair with shaking hands. She was a house slave over in Georgia. Pretty woman, real pretty. The master's son took a liking to her. I didn't want to hear this story, but I'd learned it was worse if I didn't listen. She tried to fight at first, he continued, watching me struggle with my hairpins, but she learned, like you're learning. Sometimes fighting just makes it worse. Sometimes the smartest thing is to accept what is. This ain't the same, I whispered. Ain't it? He reached over, fixed one of my pins with gentle fingers. Way I see it, we're both prisoners here, Miss Mildred. You to your skin, me to mine. Least we got each other. That's when I understood something that broke what was left of my spirit. He really believed that in his twisted mind, this was some kind of love story, him and me against the world. He'd built a whole tale around it, painted himself as tragic and me as willing. And he'd told that lie so many times he'd made it true for himself. But it wasn't true for me. What was happening in that barn, in that cabin, in all them dark corners where he caught me, that wasn't love. That was something else, something that was killing me, piece by piece, day by day. God gave me strength to endure it, though I didn't feel strong. Just felt empty, like a corn-husk doll, with all the stuffing pulled out. But I kept breathing, kept walking, kept pretending to be alive. I didn't know then that worse was coming. Didn't know that my body was about to betray me in a whole new way. Chapter 6, Abera du Abismo. By the time the summer heat of '59 hit Alabama like a Castillon skillet, I'd missed my monthly twice. I was 15 years old and so ignorant about my own body that at first I thought maybe I was dying. Seemed fitting, really, insides rotting to match how I felt outside. But when the morning sickness started, even a girl as sheltered as me couldn't deny what was happening. I remember the exact moment, I knew for sure. Was bent over the wash basin, losing what little breakfast I'd managed to choke down, when Mama came up behind me. "Lord have mercy," she said, and her voice had gone strange. "Mildred, honey, when was your last monthly?" I couldn't answer, just stared at the dirty water and wished I could disappear down that drain. The next hour was the worst of my life up to that point. Mama sat me down at the kitchen table, sent Samuel and Ruth outside, and asked me questions I couldn't answer without destroying everything. Who was it? How long had this been going on? Why hadn't I told her? "Mildred Ann Carter. You answer me right now," she said, but her voice was breaking. "Who did this to you?" That's when Ezekiel knocked on the back door. "Polite as you please, Mrs. Carter." Mr. Carter asked me to fetch the toolbox from the shed. Mama looked at him through the screen door, then back at me, and I saw the exact second she understood. My face must have told her everything, the way I shrank back, the way my hands started shaking, the way I couldn't look at either of them. "You stay right there," she told him, her voice deadly quiet. Then she grabbed my arm and dragged me to my room, locked the door behind us. "That man," she whispered, and her face had gone white as fresh cotton. "That man touched you." I nodded, and it was like a dam burst. Everything came pouring out. The reading lessons, the cabin, the threats, all of it. Mama held me while I sobbed, rocking me like she did when I was little, whispering prayers and promises that it would be all right. But here's where the story takes a turn you might not expect. When I finally stopped crying, Mama pulled back and looked me dead in the eye. "You can't tell your daddy," she said. "What?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mama, we got to listen to me," she said, gripping my shoulders hard. "You tell your daddy, and he'll kill that man. Kill him dead. And then they'll hang your daddy for murdering a colored man. You want to lose your baby and your daddy both." I stared at her, understanding dawning, horrible and slow. "We'll send you to stay with my sister in Mobile," she continued, already planning. "Tell folks you got the scarlet fever, need the sea air to recover. You'll have the baby there, give it up for adoption. Come home when it's over." "But Mama, this is the only way," she said firmly. "We protect this family. That's what we do." That night at dinner, I watched Daddy eat his cornbread and talk about the cotton crop while that monster served us sweet tea like nothing had happened. Mama smiled and chatted, normal as could be, but I saw how her hand trembled when she passed the butter. 2 days later, Ezekiel came to me one last time, found me in the root cellar where Mama had sent me for preserves. "Your Mama knows," he said, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked scared. "I can see it in how she looks at me." "Good," I spat out, feeling brave now that it was almost over. "I hope she tells Daddy. I hope he kills you." He grabbed my arm then, hard enough to bruise. "You think you're saved? You think this ends clean? Girl, you're carrying my baby. That's gonna follow you forever. Every time you look in a mirror, you're gonna remember me." He was right about that part. Lord help me, he was right. But he was wrong about Mama. She didn't tell Daddy, not then. She spent the next week making arrangements, writing letters, planning my exile. I was to leave Sunday after church, take the train to Mobile where Aunt Catherine would meet me. Saturday night, I heard Mama crying in her room, Daddy trying to comfort her. "What's wrong, honey? Is it Mildred? She's been acting so strange lately. Just worried about her health," Mama lied. "This fever's been so hard on her." I lay in my bed, hand on my still flat stomach, and wondered if that tiny life inside me could feel how unwanted it was, wondered if it knew it was made from violence, not love, wondered if Mama's plan would work, or if we were all just dancing on the edge of disaster. That Sunday morning started like any other, except I knew it was my last in that house for a long while. Mama had packed my bag the night before, hid it in the barn so Daddy wouldn't ask questions. The plan was simple. After church, she'd tell him I needed to visit Aunt Catherine for my health, and he'd drive me to the train station, none the wiser. I sat in that pew feeling like I had a scarlet letter burned into my forehead. Sure, everybody could see what I was. The preacher talked about sin and redemption, and I wondered if there was enough forgiveness in all of heaven for what had been done to me and what was growing inside me. But God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes He puts angels in the strangest places. After the service, while folks were milling around outside, I noticed Ezekiel weren't nowhere to be found. He always stayed for the church social, helped serve lemonade to the white folks, played the grateful servant. But that day, his usual spot by the side door was empty. That's when Miss Beulah approached me. Now, Miss Beulah was what folks called touched, a colored woman who'd lost her mind years back when her son got lynched. She wandered around town talking to herself, harmless but unsettling. Most folks, white and colored alike, gave her a wide berth, but that morning, she walked right up to me, looked me dead in the eye with a clarity I'd never seen in her before, and pressed something into my hand. It was a small glass bottle, no bigger than my thumb, filled with clear liquid. Then she leaned in close, and what she whispered made my blood run cold and hot all at once. She knew, somehow, this crazy old woman knew everything about Ezekiel, about the baby, about Mama's plan to send me away. More than that, she knew something I didn't. She told me where Ezekiel really came from, why he'd left Montgomery. It wasn't no romantic tragedy like he'd said. The man was a devil who'd done this before, 2 other girls, and each time he'd moved on when things got too hot, found another family to serve, another girl to destroy. The bottle she gave me, Lord forgive me for even thinking about using it, but I was desperate and scared and only
She said,
it would make the baby go away, make it like none of this ever happened. Said she'd used it herself once, long time ago, before her mind broke. I stood there holding that bottle, feeling its weight like it was made of lead instead of glass. Here was a way out that didn't involve months of shame in Mobile, didn't involve giving birth to my rapist's child. But it also meant taking a life, even one made from violence. That's when I saw him. Ezekiel was loading his things into a wheelbarrow out behind the church. He was running. The coward was actually running, leaving before my daddy could find out, before he had to face what he'd done. But he wasn't quite fast enough. See, Miss Beulah hadn't just come to me. She'd been busy that morning, whispering in other ears and sometimes the Lord uses the broken and the cast aside to do His work. Old Moses, the colored man who swept up at the general store, he'd seen things. The widow Washington who took in washing, she'd noticed things. Even simple-minded Jerome who mucked out stalls at the livery, he'd put pieces together. They'd all kept quiet before because what could they do? A colored person couldn't accuse another colored person of hurting a white girl. That would bring hellfire down on all of them. But Miss Beulah, she didn't care about consequences no more. She'd already lost everything that mattered. And that morning, she'd told them all that Ezekiel was fixing to run, that he'd done what he'd done, and was about to escape justice. I found out later that they tried to stop him, peaceful like at first, told him to wait, to face what was coming, like a man. But Ezekiel, he pulled a knife, threatened them, tried to force his way past. That's when my daddy came around the corner of the church and saw the commotion. Saw Ezekiel with his knife out. Saw the other colored folks trying to hold him back. Saw me standing there with tears streaming down my face and Miss Beulah's bottle clutched in my hand. And in that moment, I swear the whole world held its breath, because everybody there knew something had to give. That this couldn't end with whispers and sent away girls and men who moved on to hurt others. The reckoning had come, whether we were ready or not. What happened next behind that church changed everything. Daddy's face went from confused to understanding, to something I'd never seen before. A rage so pure it was almost holy. He didn't say nothing, just started walking toward Ezekiel with the kind of purpose that makes wise men step aside. The other colored folks scattered like quail, even Miss Bula leaving just Daddy and Ezekiel in that dusty space behind the church. I wanted to run too, but my feet were rooted to that spot, like God himself had nailed them down. Ezekiel tried to talk his way out at first, then he tried to run, then he tried to fight. But Daddy had worked the land his whole life, had hands like iron and arms like tree trunks. What he did to that man, well, I won't describe it all. Just know that when red dirt turns redder, it don't ever wash clean. When it was over, Daddy stood there, breathing hard, his Sunday shirt torn and bloody. He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time in months, and I saw his heart break right there in his eyes. He knew, not just what Ezekiel had done, but that I'd been carrying it alone, that his little girl had been dying inside while he'd been praising the very devil who was killing her. The ride home was silent except for Mama's quiet crying. She'd come running when she heard the commotion. Found us all standing around Ezekiel's body like we were at some unholy funeral. Daddy had picked me up like I was 5 years old again, carried me to the truck. And nobody, not the preacher, not the sheriff who was there for church, not anybody, said a word to stop us. That night, after Samuel and Ruth were in bed, Daddy and Uncle Vernon went back to the church. They loaded what was left of Ezekiel into Uncle Vernon's truck and drove out to our property. To that old, dried-up well behind the barn that hadn't seen water in 20 years. I watched from my bedroom window as they lowered him down into that darkness. Watched as they shoveled dirt and rocks on top, filling it halfway. The next day, Daddy had 3 loads of cement delivered. Told folks he was finally filling in that dangerous old well so us kids wouldn't fall in. He mixed and poured that concrete himself, working from dawn to dusk, not letting nobody else help. When he was done, that well was sealed up tighter than a tomb, and Ezekiel was buried beneath enough concrete to build a house foundation. But my baby didn't disappear with its father. My belly kept growing, and Mama's plan had to change. No explanation of scarlet fever would cover what had happened behind the church. Though folks pretended to believe whatever story we told, the colored community kept silent. They'd hated Ezekiel as much as they'd feared him, turned out, and the white folks, well, they figured some things were better left unspoken. So, instead of Aunt Catherine's, I was sent to the Magdalene Home for Wayward Girls up in Tennessee. It was a place run by stern-faced nuns who didn't ask questions about how good Christian girls ended up in trouble. Long as your family could pay, they'd hide your shame until it was born and given away. I spent 6 months in that place, scrubbing floors and praying rosaries and feeling that baby move inside me like a constant reminder of everything I wanted to forget. The other girls there had their own stories. Some had loved boys they shouldn't have. Some had trusted men they should have feared. And some, like me, hadn't had no choice at all. When my time came, it was a hard birth. 23 hours of labor, like my body was fighting to keep that baby inside where it couldn't be taken from me. Because sometime during those long months, I'd started feeling things I didn't expect. When he kicked, when he hiccuped, when he rolled around in there, he was innocent of his father's sins, wasn't he? They let me hold him for 5 minutes after he was born. 5 minutes to memorize his face, to whisper apologies he'd never remember, to say goodbye to the only good thing that had come from all that evil. He had my nose and Ezekiel's long fingers, and when he wrapped that tiny hand around my thumb, I understood that love and hate could exist in the same heart at the same time. The nuns took him away, and I never saw him again. They said he went to a good family up north, folks who'd raise him right, never tell him where he came from. I signed papers saying I gave him up willingly, though nothing about any of it was willing. Then I went home to a town that pretended nothing had happened, to a family that never spoke Ezekiel's name again, to a sealed well that became just another part of the landscape. But secrets don't stay buried, no matter how much concrete you pour on top. Coming home from that place in Tennessee was like trying to fit back into a dress that don't fit no more. Everything looked the same, the house, the barn, the fields stretching out under the Alabama sun, but I was different down to my bones. 16 years old and felt like 90, carrying secrets that weighed more than that concrete over Ezekiel's grave. Daddy couldn't look at me straight for months. He'd work the fields from Kansas to Kansas, come home covered in dirt and exhaustion, eat his supper in silence. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at that spot behind the barn where the well used to be, and I knew he was thinking about what he'd done. what he'd had to do because he'd failed to protect me when it mattered. Mama tried to make things normal, bless her heart. She'd chatter about church gossip and who was courting who, like if she talked enough she could fill up all that silence between us. But at night, I'd hear her crying into her pillow, and I knew she was grieving for the daughter I used to be and the grandchild she'd never know. The town played along with our pretense. When I showed back up after 6 months away, folks smiled and said how good I looked, how that Tennessee air must have done me good. Nobody mentioned how I'd left sudden-like after Ezekiel disappeared. Nobody asked why Daddy had filled in that old well with enough concrete to build a dam. In small towns, sometimes the kindest thing folks can do is pretend not to know what they know. But I couldn't pretend, not inside my own head. Every night I'd dream about my baby, wonder what they'd named him, if he was walking yet, if his new mama sang to him the way I would have. I'd dream about Ezekiel too, see him climbing up out of that well, concrete crumbling off him like old skin, coming for me with those hands that had taken everything. The worst part was the waiting for someone to find out, for the law to come knocking, for God to strike us down for what we'd done. Every time a strange car came down our road, my heart would stop. Every time the sheriff came by to chat with Daddy about nothing in particular, I'd hold my breath until he left. 3 years passed that way. 3 years of jumping at shadows and keeping secrets and trying to rebuild some kind of life from the ashes of what had been. I finished school, started helping Mama with her seamstress work, even let Billy Morrison court me for a while, though I couldn't stand for him to touch me, not even to hold hands. Then came the day that changed everything again. I was 19, hanging wash on the line, when a car I didn't recognize pulled up to our house. A man got out, tall, well-dressed, colored but with skin light enough to pass if he'd wanted. He had long fingers that drummed against his leg nervous-like, and something about that gesture made my blood turn to ice water. He told me his name was William, that he'd been adopted as a baby by a professor and his wife up in Chicago. Said he'd always known he was adopted but had recently started searching for his birth family. He'd traced records from the Magdalene home, followed a trail of whispers and rumors south, and now here he was, standing in my daddy's yard with Ezekiel's hands in my nose. My son had come looking for me. The baby I'd held for 5 minutes had grown into a man who wanted answers I couldn't give. How could I tell him his father was a monster buried under concrete out back? How could I explain that his very existence was proof of the worst thing that ever happened to me, but that I'd loved him anyway in those few minutes I'd had him? I stood there with wet sheets in my hands, watching my past and future collide in the form of this stranger who shared my blood. And I knew that some sins don't stay buried no matter how deep you dig the hole. The red dirt of Alabama had given up its secret, and now I had to decide what truth I could live with telling. He waited patient-like while I gathered myself, and in that patience I saw something that made me want to weep. He was nothing like his father. There was a gentleness in him, a careful way of holding himself that spoke of good raising and kind hearts. Whatever family had taken him in, they loved him right. But that almost made it worse, because now I had to choose between protecting this good man from the ugly truth of his beginning, or finally, after all these years, letting the whole terrible story see the light of day. Standing there looking at William, that's what his adopted folks had named him, I made a decision that surprised even me. I told him to wait right there and went inside to where Mama was sitting at her sewing machine. She took one look at my face and knew something earth-shattering had happened. I brought her outside, and when she saw William, she grabbed the porch rail for support. But Mama, Lord bless her, she recovered quicker than me. She invited him in for sweet tea like he was any other visitor, and we sat at that kitchen table where so much pain had been revealed years before. But here's the part that still takes my breath away when I think on it. William didn't come alone. He'd brought a manila folder with him, and inside were documents that changed everything I thought I knew about Ezekiel. His name wasn't even Ezekiel. It was Marcus Thompson, and he'd been running from the law for near 20 years. There were newspaper clippings about girls in Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana. Always the same story. He'd work for a family, gain their trust, and then some young girl would end up in trouble. But he was smart, always moved on before anybody could prove nothing, always had another name ready. William had hired a private detective to trace his biological father, and what they'd found was a trail of destroyed lives stretching back decades. At least 12 girls that they knew of, probably more. Some had killed themselves. Some had been sent away and never came back. All of them had been like me, young, isolated, and nobody believed them over the godly servant. But that wasn't the biggest shock. The detective had found something else. Marcus Thompson, the man I knew as Ezekiel, had a brother. A twin brother named Samuel Thompson who'd been looking for him for years, trying to stop him, trying to get him help for what he called his brother's sickness. This Samuel had kept journals, documented everything, tried to build a case. He'd been one step behind Marcus in Montgomery, arrived in our town 3 days after Daddy had filled in that well. He'd gone to the sheriff, but without a body and with the whole town keeping silent, there wasn't nothing to be done. Samuel was still alive, William told us, living in a nursing home in Atlanta, 93 years old and still carrying the weight of what his brother had done. William had visited him, and the old man had wept, said he'd been praying for Marcus's victims every day for 60 years. That's when I understood why William had really come, not just to find his birth mother, but to find all of Marcus's victims, to document their stories, to give them the voice they'd never had. He was a lawyer now, worked for a nonprofit that helped survivors of abuse. He wanted to write a book, not for money but to make sure girls like me weren't forgotten, that what happened to us mattered. Mama asked him gentle-like if he knew what had happened to his father. William nodded, said the detective had figured that out too, the timing of the disappearance, the suddenly filled well, the silence of the whole town. He said he understood why Daddy had done what he did, that he held no anger about it. I finally found my voice then, told him I was sorry he'd been born from such evil, that I'd wanted to keep him but couldn't. He reached across that table and took my hand, those long fingers so like his father's butt holding mine with such gentleness, and said something I'll never forget. He said trauma wasn't genetic, said he'd been raised by good people who taught him that where you come from don't determine where you're going, said he'd spent his whole career fighting for women like me because somewhere deep inside, maybe he'd always known his story started with violence, but didn't have to end with it. We talked until the sun went down, and when he left, he promised to stay in touch. He did, too. Came back every few months, brought his wife and children to meet us. My grandchildren, playing in the same yard where their grandfather had stalked me. But they were full of light and love and everything he'd tried to steal from the world. William's book came out 2 years later. He told my story, and the stories of all them other girls Marcus had hurt. It helped change laws, got people talking about things they'd rather keep silent. And Samuel Thompson, Marcus's brother, he lived just long enough to see it published, to know that his brother's evil had been documented, and that the survivors had finally been heard. I'm 80 now, and that sealed well is still out there behind the barn. Sometimes new owners want to dig it up, put in a garden or something, but I always talk them out of it. Some things need to stay buried, but the silence, that's what needed to die. And thanks to my son, the one good thing that came from all that bad, it finally did. God works in mysterious ways, indeed. He took my deepest shame and turned it into my greatest blessing. Sent me a son who'd dedicate his life to making sure no other girl suffered in silence like I did. That's what I call redemption. That's what I call grace.